As you know, one of the famous people in the 20th century believed to have had bipolar disorder was Sir Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister who led his country to victory over Hitler and the Third Reich during World War II. Sir Winston once said, "The farther backward you can look, the farther forward you're likely to see." I'm usually introduced as Tom, but my legal name is Frank Thomas Roberts III. I carry the name of my father and his father, and I recently observed my 65th birthday. I tell you my age only to put my story into historical context, and because many of you may be from younger generations born by 1980 or later. It's often said that a person is the sum of their memories. Your memory and recall is what makes you who you are. So this is who I am. I remember the days of black and white television and live shows like Liberace performing or the Mickey Mouse Club. I remember the Eisenhower presidency, JFK's election as president, and where I was and what I was doing the moment I heard President Kennedy had been assassinated. I lived through the space race and the civil rights movement, and grieved when Martin Luther King was shot to death in Memphis, only 90 miles from my home in Arkansas. I had to register for the draft when I turned 18 in August 1968. I carried my draft card in my billfold as I started college in September, and lived in fear that I might fail my courses and have to go to war. A war two of my high school friends did not come back alive. Richard Nixon had gotten the Republican presidential nomination and won his first term in November that year. Nixon's first term covered my undergraduate years and when I began my story of mental illness. I live on the beach just north of San Clemente, California, where Nixon had his Western White House. A half-hour drive from me is the Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda. Whenever I go there and step into the iconic Marine One, where this photo was shot of Nixon after his resignation, I pause at his grave and remember two things. He ended the draft and took the fear out of me having to go to Vietnam, especially when he replaced the draft with a lottery, and I had a high lottery number which made military service unlikely. But I also remember the days and weeks of misery over those 4 years and for the next 21 years as I suffered from my first episodes of major depression. I carried the wounds of mental illness in my family. Dad, he learned 2 years before he died at age 62, had bipolar disorder. His mania exploded in domestic violence and alcoholic binges witnessed by my brothers, sisters, and me. The household emotional dynamic was determined by the mental illness. My siblings and I should have been helped by our dad by keeping the emotional atmosphere positive and stable. We weren't given the freedom to just be kids. That's why I say mental illness is a family disease. We were always uneasy. To complicate the craziness, my 34-year-old mother died suddenly of a ruptured brain aneurysm when I was 14. It was the day before my brother Jerry's 7th birthday, and our baby brother Randy was barely 3. It took me 40 years to fully grieve that loss. When I was an undergraduate, and my hair was as black as a moonless night, and my face wasn't lined like a California road map, I majored in speech and drama with a minor in religion. I wanted to be a religious broadcaster. Those were the days long before sex and corruption scandals ended the TV ministries of famous preachers like Jim and Tammy Faye Baker and Jimmy Swaggart. I was pastor of a country church my first 2 years in college and often asked to be guest preacher at larger churches. I was ordained to the ministry and referred to as a reverend in May 1970 and married a preacher's daughter the next month. I was 19. My career seemed set. There was one problem. It was what Winston Churchill called his black dog. I was often overwhelmed by periods of depression with recurring thoughts of suicide. Maybe if I prayed more, it would go away, I told myself like a little boy whistling in the dark. One day it got so bad that I went into our apartment bathroom while my wife was in class and lay down in front of a gas space heater and turned on the gas. Something seemed to force me to turn off the gas and open the door. Was I afraid to die? I don't know, but it wouldn't be the last time I would come that close to taking my life. Whenever I wasn't depressed, I was active in university theater as a performer. In fact, I played Scrooge in a production of A Christmas Carol and got standing ovations at every performance. It was exhilarating, and I started to think about becoming a professional actor instead of a preacher. As I look back on my college years, there were clues I was mentally ill. The frequent depressions, of course, but the other was a favor psychology majors would ask me to do for them. They had to score a little test for their psych classes called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI. Perhaps you've heard of it. The MMPI has been the gold standard in personality testing since 1939 as an adult measure of psychopathology and personality structure. In retrospect, 40 years later, I think my friends thought I was nuts, and word got around to other psych majors. Wait till you see Tom Roberts' score. Today's college students are reporting that they are more depressed and overwhelmed than ever before. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for college students. Nearly 50% of students suffering from a mental illness never seek help from their college or university. When asked why not, the number one response was a fear of stigma. That's why I love to speak to college students, as I did at the University of North Carolina and Duke University last fall. I called my talk "The Speech I Wish I Had Heard When I Was an Undergraduate." By the time of my junior year, I decided to leave the ministry and knew I couldn't make a living as an actor, so I planned to go to graduate school to earn a master's in radio, TV, film with an emphasis in broadcast journalism. If I couldn't be like Marlon Brando, maybe I could be the next Walter Cronkite on CBS. I won national recognition for my thesis, which was a biography of the founder of CBS News, Paul W. White. After grad school, I worked as a co-anchorman for a television station, radio news director, and anchor reporter for another radio station, while I freelanced for the National Public Radio program All Things Considered, The Voice of America, and ABC Radio News. It was my final full-time radio jobs that I was fired for the first time in my life. I'd started drinking when in graduate school and used alcohol as self-medication for depression, too stupid to realize alcohol is a depressant. One time I was covering the Vice President of the United States, Walter Mondale, as he spoke at a luncheon in Kansas City. There was a bottle of wine on each table, and I'd got a table with only one other reporter. Let's just say after the Vice President's speech, the wine bottle at our table was empty, and the other reporter had drunk less than a glass. Those were pre-cell phone days, of course, so I had to file my report by two-way radio from the station's car. And it was a hot day. The heat and the alcohol didn't mix well. I was so drunk the producer of the station couldn't use my report for the next newscast. The firing, however, came a few months later, when I started hyperventilating one morning when I was on the air delivering the news. I just couldn't catch my breath, and finally signaled the DJ to go to music. It was as if I had never been on the air before, but I'd been in broadcasting for several years by that time. I was having what I learned years later was a panic attack, likely caused by chronic depression and alcohol abuse. I was humiliated on the air, heard by thousands of people in Kansas City and beyond. I was fired the next day. Fortunately, and thanks to a good friend, I got my first university faculty position a month later at a small Christian school in my home state of Arkansas, teaching broadcast journalism and performance. That's where my double life took over in earnest. Not only could I not drink or smoke, I did both, but divorce was unacceptable. And the hardest part was hiding my depressions. Christians just didn't get depressed, I thought, especially Christian professors. I was terrified of the stigma. If anyone knew and its impact on my teaching position. One of my self-medicators, and one for which I am most ashamed, was infidelity. Bipolar disorder's dirty little secret. As most of you know, it is one of the most common but most taboo bipolar symptoms. Sexual indiscretions is such a significant marker of bipolar illness that it is included in the DSM-4's diagnostic criteria. Bipolar infidelity is an explanation, not an excuse. The bottom line is that those of us who have bipolar are risk-takers. Cheating on your partner is risky. You might get caught, and like me, lose everything. I've never been proud of what I did. I really don't think it is about love or passion. It's about illness. I'm ashamed of having caused my children's mother so much pain, and for the impact divorce had on my 5-year-old daughter and 8-year-old son. In 2009, my openness about infidelity caught the interest of a frequent guest on CNN's Larry King Live show, media psychiatrist and best-selling author Dr. Carol Lieberman. She had written a book called Bad Boys, How We Love Them, How to Live with Them, and When to Leave Them. It's about men who cheat. Her next book was to be called Bad Girls, Why Men Love Them and How Good Girls Can Learn Their Secrets. I had known a few bad girls, so Dr. Lieberman chose me as one of her interview subjects. She changed my name to protect the guilty. Now, you may want to read it out of curiosity, but I always tell other men, do not follow my example. It not only hurts others, but it can put you at risk for violence from the other person's spouse. Had I known when I was an undergraduate during the Nixon years I had bipolar, a genetic brain disorder that usually manifests itself in the late teens or early 20s, I could have saved an 18-year marriage to my high school sweetheart, separation from my little boy and girl, loss of my university faculty position, and humiliation as word got around that I was working as a hospital emergency room janitor living in an unheated cabin in the country. All that came after a manic adventure to Hollywood in 1988, where I had escaped with a woman I met in a psychiatric hospital. Seemed like a good idea to me. I was delusional, convinced I could earn a living as a film actor, my dream since high school. I was 38. The psychiatrist at the hospital where I'd just been treated for major depression, that had lasted for 6 months by then, prescribed a new antidepressant called, you guessed it, Prozac. It had just come on the market, and it was the worst one for this manic depressive because it sent me from suicidal depression to the moon in a week. At least in Hollywood, it was literally to the stars. What goes up must come down. Bipolar follows the law of physics. When I ran out of Prozac a few months later and the manic high ended on Hollywood Boulevard, the black dog returned, barking its head off, and seemed to be telling me to jump off the end of the Santa Monica Pier. Instead, I ran away. I took an agonizing 3-day ride on a Greyhound bus back to Arkansas, hoping to save my marriage and faculty position, but it was all gone. It took 5 years before I would learn what caused me to do the things I did, derailing my life and shaming my family. I knew there was chronic major depression and that antidepressants could help me feel better for a while, but with no health insurance and no community mental health clinics that I knew of, I was stuck in what the 23rd Psalm called the valley of the shadow of death. What I had yet to learn was something composer Claude Debussy said. The music is the space between the notes. And when I felt good, it was often too good. You don't go to the doctor during those times and say, "Doc, I feel great. What's wrong with me?" As many of you know, that's why diagnosis of bipolar disorder is so difficult, and usually takes an average of 7 years from the onset of symptoms before diagnosis. It was 23 years in my case. Ignorance and fear of stigma wasted all those years lost forever. My second stay at a psychiatric hospital came a year after I returned from Hollywood. It was forced by a friend who was afraid I would kill myself because of severe depression. While I was a patient and taking a new antidepressant that helped me sleep and feel a little better, I was sitting in the hospital's day room one afternoon playing cards with 3 other patients. Old Leroy, as we called him, was sitting next to the wall in the day room. No one had ever heard old Leroy make a sound since he was brought to the hospital by sheriff's deputies after he was discovered naked in the woods, howling at the moon. He was on hold for transfer to the state hospital in Little Rock. I guess he had schizophrenia, bless his heart. Anyway, old Leroy started laughing, surprising us since he had never spoken. One of the ladies playing cards with me asked, "Old Leroy, what are you laughing about?" Old Leroy pointed his bony index finger at me and said, "He's crazy." That was the best diagnosis to date. The saddest day in my life had always been Mom's death, December 17th, 1964. However, it was soon to be replaced 28 years later. I'd lost my marriage and college teaching position by then, and I was living in a dilapidated house crawling with roaches and mice I shared with an ex-convict. "Beware the Ides of March," Shakespeare wrote in his play. Julius Caesar, as the fortune-teller, warned the emperor of his imminent assassination. On March 15th, the Ides, 1992, a Sunday afternoon, my housemate left a message on the kitchen counter that I needed to call my stepmother because of a death in the family. I assumed it was my dad, who had been critically ill with heart disease. My stepmother's sister, May, answered the phone. "I'm so sorry, Tommy. They found him in the woods this afternoon." It was the moment that defined who I am today and why I'm here speaking to you. My brother Jerry's decomposing body had been found by 2 dirt bikers as they raced through the woods. Jerry had disappeared 2 weeks earlier. He was found sitting at the foot of a pine tree with an empty quart of Jack Daniels whiskey at one side and an empty bottle of prescription narcotics on the other side. Decomposition delayed positive identification, but his driver's license told the story of the missing man everyone had been looking for in the little Arkansas town nestled in the Ozarks. The state medical examiner confirmed his identity with dental records and ruled his death a suicide. Jerry was 35, 1 year older than our mom when she died. He left behind a wife and 2 little boys, Christopher and little Jerry. As his widow, Renee, and I stood next to the casket at the funeral home, she told me that Jerry was diagnosed with bipolar disorder a few years earlier when he was in the Army, and immediately discharged without treatment. She said Jerry was too embarrassed once out of the Army to ask for psychiatric help. The Veterans Administration Hospital did, however, provide what is called the drunk tank, where veterans could go to dry off from a drinking binge. It was from the drunk tank that Jerry called me in late February. I tried to get him to come stay with me for a while at my house in northwest Arkansas. "Oh, I have to get home to Renee and the boys," he said. Those were the last words my brother ever said to me. I tried to speak at his funeral, to tell his boys and the others in attendance how kind and generous Jerry was to me following my divorce and unemployment by allowing me to live with him for a few months. The tears choked out every word I tried to say, so I dedicate my work as a speaker and writer now to his memory. Dad's heart disease killed him 3 months after Jerry's suicide, but I think he really died of a broken heart. After nearly 5 years of low-paying jobs, I got a decent job related to my background in broadcasting, videotaping, knee surgeries, and producing patient education videos. My good friend and employer at the time, Dr. James Arnold, had the courage to tell me a year after hiring me that my behavior scared other people on the staff, and he believed me to be bipolar. "I don't want you to come back to the office," he said, "until you've seen a psychiatrist." That was after he escorted me out of an operating room mid-surgery early on a Monday morning. On Friday, Good Friday, 1993, psychiatrist Dr. Jeffrey Tate asked me what's going on. I finished my answer an hour later. "There's no doubt in my mind, Mr. Roberts, that you have bipolar disorder. I'm writing a prescription for lithium you are to start immediately. I won't hospitalize you now, and I'll see you next week." The good doctor made a mistake in not hospitalizing me, because 2 days later, Easter Sunday, I found myself in another town and locked up in a general hospital psych ward. That was brutal. But another story. While I waited for the lithium prescription to be filled that Friday, I went to a Borders bookstore to find a book about bipolar, so I could learn more about it. I spotted actress Patty Duke's book, A Brilliant Madness. I'd seen the TV movie about her life and struggle with manic depression 2 years earlier, and my then 6-year-old daughter wanted to watch it every time I got to see her and her brother for our monthly visits. She must have recognized her daddy in Patty's story, but was too young to explain it. I bought the book. On the inside cover I wrote, "I was diagnosed today, Good Friday, 1993, with bipolar disorder. Thank God I know what's wrong with me." The long journey of recovery had begun. Sometimes the road was bumpy, other times smooth. I wish my psychiatrist had told me what to expect for my future and that it will get better. I wish he had told me about the early warning signs of an episode of depression or hypomania and how to tell the difference between my illness and the normal ups and downs in life. It took years before I would ever know I had bipolar 2. Regardless of whether you have bipolar 1 or 2, they're both awful. One very bumpy time came 5 years after Jerry's suicide. I had moved to the San Francisco Bay Area for a new career as a technical writer in the Silicon Valley. My younger sister, Chris, who had been diagnosed with bipolar 3 years earlier, called me early one morning. She was crying and said, "Teresa's dead." Teresa was my stepsister. She had fought major depressions for years, and self-medicated with prescription narcotics she would write for herself as she doctor shopped. She was eventually convicted of drug-related offenses and sentenced to 5 years in prison. She was clean when she got out of prison, but the depressions returned, and she was back on the pills. She died of an overdose all alone in her apartment. I learned from a cousin years later Teresa was cutting herself. Most psychiatrists would consider a clear pathway to suicide, and taken to a local hospital emergency room in her small Arkansas town, patched up and sent home. She refused psychiatric treatment because she feared stigma associated with mental illness. I guess it was okay for people to know she was an ex-con and a lesbian, and, like our brother, death, in her view, was better than being stigmatized for having a mental illness. Who's crazier, the mentally ill, or a society that stigmatizes them so much they fear getting help? That's no different in my mind than conspiracy to commit murder. As all of you know, bipolar disorder is an illness that can be managed over time, not an illness that can be cured over time, although there is some promise in genetic research that can lead to more successful medications. My therapist told me recently he thinks I know more about bipolar disorder than most psychiatrists. That's because I've lived with it, not studied it. Well, I don't give myself that kind of credit because I owe my life to psychiatrists who prescribe effective medication for me. I continue to learn in my recovery how to manage my moods by medication compliance first and foremost, getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night instead of 2 or 3, as I did for years. Daily exercise, thanks to my dog Ferris, and in the process, I've come up with a different interpretation of a New Testament verse I often quoted when I was a young preacher back in Arkansas. It's from the Gospel of John. Jesus said, "The thief comes in the night to steal and kill, but I've come so that you might have life, and life more abundantly." Today, I think of mental illness as that thief in the night, and the abundant life as possible, once past stigma to diagnosis and treatment, and on to recovery. Why do I spend my time and energy and what should be my golden years as a husband, dad, and grandfather telling my story and speaking out against mental illness stigma? 2 very good reasons. My brother and sister. I wept again at my brother's grave next to our mother's when I visited the cemetery in Arkansas last November, just before the 50th anniversary of Mom's death, and then walked across the cemetery to Teresa's resting place, asking forgiveness for not being there to help her after I started treatment for bipolar. As all of you so painfully know, the first anniversary of Robin Williams' suicide was yesterday. He was asked by James Lipton on Actors Studio back in 2001, "If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?" Robin responds, "If heaven exists, to know that there's laughter." That would be a great thing. This photo of Robin and me was taken just after he entertained all of us at a party. I always wondered why he looked so sad when he was not performing. I thought he was just tired. Now we all know. I have a link to an article about Robin's mental illness on my website, tomspeaksout.com. I also speak for the 22 U.S. war veterans who commit suicide every day from untreated PTSD, 1 every 80 minutes. I also speak for the 41,000 Americans, many between the ages of 15 and 25, who kill themselves each year, 1 every 12.8 minutes. I also speak on behalf of the suicide victims worldwide, who make their final exit every 40 seconds. Studies show that when we feel support and empathy from those around us during our period of healing, we tend to recover faster and to a fuller extent. When suffering with mental illness, you might be better off keeping your mouth shut about it, or at least be very selective in choosing who to tell, or it could derail your career. That's why I will not retire from the faculty of a private university this year after 35 years of teaching. Instead, I look back in disgust with myself over walking away from it, but I walked away fearing stigma because of psychiatric hospitalization. It is ironic that one of my students, Frank, committed suicide by hanging himself from a steam pipe in the basement of the university's chapel, yet no one ever spoke of mental illness in connection with this young man's death. It is absurd, isn't it, to avoid life-saving treatment out of fear of stigma? In the spirit of Nazi concentration camp survivor Elie Wiesel, in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Stigma can lead to suicide, as it did my brother and sister. Stigma can contribute to homelessness, as it does to thousands of others. Stigma can lead to crime, some petty, and some leading to shocking headlines that only perpetuate more stigma. Stigma creates myths about mental illness. Mental illness is caused by a personal weakness. A mental illness is not a character flaw. It's caused by genetic, biological, social, and environmental factors. Seeking and accepting help is a sign of strength. Mental illness will never get better. Well, with the right kind of help, most people do recover and lead healthy, productive, and satisfying lives. People with a mental illness are violent. People with a mental illness are no more violent or dangerous than the rest of the population. People with a mental illness are more likely to harm themselves or to be harmed than they are to hurt other people. When they are violent, it is usually under the influence of drug or alcohol abuse. The subtitle of this talk is Before and After Diagnosis. It may surprise you to know that I was in a mixed episode from late 2003 to early fall 2010. 6 long years. I bounced from hypomania to suicidal depression within days. It started with a major stress one dark October night in 2003, and was compounded by lack of sleep and disheartening unemployment. It created strained relationships with my now adult son and daughter, one of whom confronted me with the narcissistic side of bipolar when all I talked about was me, instead of focusing on them. Bipolar disorder will kill you. Have you tried to buy a life insurance policy if you have bipolar? I did recently, and I couldn't get it for much value without paying 3 times the normal rate, and then there's a limit. That's because for years, 1 out of 5 people with bipolar disorder committed suicide. It's now 1 in 10, by the way, but the life insurance companies try to avoid us even if we've lived with the illness for more than 2 decades, as I have. Of course, one of the horrible things about a lifetime of this illness with its hypomania and depression is that you're always left with the nagging question, is this depression my brain and my mind's breaking point? Is this the depression I end with suicide? Am I afraid? Yes. Being aware of the triggers for a depression is something I do daily, as I do with hypomania. I'm so ashamed and embarrassed whenever I reflect on those 6 years in a mixed episode. So self-forgiveness is a goal I work on with my therapist. I'm trying to get past my past with family, friends, and colleagues. My friend Gabe Howard wrote in a recent BP magazine article, "Bipolar disorder isn't our fault, but it is our responsibility." I like what Carrie Elizabeth Lynn wrote in one of her International Bipolar Foundation blog posts. Bipolar disorder is an illness that needs to be managed continuously, so you have to keep on your toes. Fighting the beast requires you to cope with, prepare for, or recover from early warning signs and triggers on an ongoing basis. Oh, by the way, I finally made it back to Hollywood. Actually, a 45-minute drive from me. I have an agent for my voiceover work and audition frequently. But most importantly, if you will pardon the expression, behind every crazy man is a great wife. I'm grateful for my wife Noha's support for my work, even encouraging me to speak for free when an organization doesn't have the budget to pay my fee. Our beautiful children and grandchildren help keep us young. My speaking and writing today comes from the inspiring words of Maya Angelou. She said, "As soon as healing takes place, go out and heal somebody else." In 1927, country lawyer Max Ehrmann wrote a prose poem called Desiderata, Latin for desired things. Calling it Spock Thoughts, the late Leonard Nimoy recited the poem on his 1968 album Two Sides of Leonard Nimoy. I leave with you my two favorite lines from Desiderata. You are a child of the universe, no less than the trees and the stars. You have a right to be here. And whether or not it is clear to you, no doubt the universe is unfolding as it should. I began my talk with a Sir Winston Churchill quote. Here are two more things he said to take with you. I always like to say I may be cracked, but I'm not broken, despite the challenges of living with bipolar disorder. Always remember that it gets better. I asked Mrs. Margaret Henley, my high school public speaking teacher, before I gave my first speech, how long my speech should be. She quoted Churchill. Well, I hope I've created enough interest in the past 40 minutes to generate questions from you. Don't hesitate to email me and I'll get back with you as soon as I can. Tom@TomSpeaksOut.com.